Hello everyone. Tonight we begin a story about the strange, haunting figure of the Plague Doctor, and the question that has echoed across centuries. Was the famous beaked mask merely a curious fashion, or truly a piece of survival gear? If you enjoy these sorts of stories, do support the channel with a like and a subscription. It genuinely helps us grow. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story, and please write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for a soft bit of background hum, and let's step together into this nighttime journey. I first put on the mask in the spring of 1656, when Venice had begun to empty itself of sound. Before that moment, I had been merely a physician's apprentice, young enough to believe that books could ward off what prayer could not, old enough to understand that the breathless scourge required no invitation. My master, Dottore Vincenzo, had trained me in the humours, in the careful letting of tainted fluids, in the mixing of tinctures, whose names I spoke like incantations: extract of wormwood, spirit of wine, powder of myrrh. He had shown me how to read a tongue's colour, how to feel the racing of a pulse beneath my fingers, how to smell corruption before it showed itself in the flesh. But he had not shown me how to walk through streets where silence lay heavier than fog, where whole families waited behind sealed doors for the unseen presence to pass them by. That knowledge came later, after the Council of Health issued their decree and the first of us donned the costume that would mark us as neither quite human nor quite phantom, something between physician and priest, between scholar and undertaker. The mask itself was the work of a French doctor, Charles Delorme, who had served in Paris during the last Great Visitation. Word of his invention had travelled south through letters and whispered consultations, arriving in Venice like a strange promise, that knowledge, properly worn, might become armour, that the corrupted air, the miasma that rose from the canals, from the piled straw in darkened alleys, from the very breath of the afflicted, could be held at bay by leather, by glass, by a beak stuffed with the sharpest herbs God had placed upon the earth. I remember the day the costume arrived at Dottore Vincenzo's studio, wrapped in oilcloth and smelling of tannery and beeswax. We unwrapped it together in the grey morning light, spreading its components across the examination table, where a week earlier we had tended to a spice merchant's festering leg. The coat was longer than any garment I'd worn, falling nearly to my ankles, and had been soaked in wax until it shone like the carapace of some great beetle. It was the colour of old blood, or perhaps that is merely how memory paints it now. The gloves reached past my elbows. The boots had been sealed at every seam with tallow, so that no gap remained where the unseen presence might creep in. But it was the mask that held us both in silence. The leather was thick and dark, fitted to cover the entire face. 2 circular windows of glass had been set where the eyes should be, giving the thing an expression that was not quite human, not quite anything at all. And from the face protruded the beak, longer than my hand, curved slightly downward like some great carrion bird, hollow within and waiting to be filled with our defences. Rose petals dried to powder, sprigs of juniper, crushed camphor, cloves soaked in vinegar, mint leaves that still held their green colour even in death. "This is what we have come to," Vincenzo said quietly, running his fingers along the beak's length. "We dress ourselves as creatures of nightmare to fight a nightmare we cannot see." "Does it work?" I asked him. He looked at me then, and I saw in his eyes something I had not seen before. Not fear, but a deeper thing, a weariness that spoke of questions asked too many times without answer. "It must work," he said, "for if it does not, then we have already lost more than our lives. We have lost our reason for standing in the darkness at all. Would you have put it on? Would you have believed that herbs and glass could keep the shadow at bay?" I did not know, that morning, whether I believed, but I knew that the council had named me Plague Doctor, that the contract had been signed, the payment arranged, the boundaries of my district marked on the map with red ink. I knew that when the bells tolled 3 times in succession, I would be expected to walk through doors that others fled from, that I would examine the afflicted, record their names and addresses, certify when their time had ceased, and ensure that what remained was removed according to law and decency. I knew that the mask would be my companion through all of this, and that I would come to know its interior more intimately than any cathedral, any book, any human face. So, I lifted it from the table. I opened the beak and began to fill it with what we had prepared. First the vinegar-soaked cloth as a base, then the dried roses, the mint, the myrrh, resin ground to powder, the camphor that burned the nostrils even before it entered the mask. Vincenzo helped me pack it tight, ensuring that every breath I drew would pass through this fortress of scent, this wall of ancient knowledge pressed into service against the new terror. Then I put it on. The world changed instantly. Sound became muffled as though I had plunged my head beneath water. My breathing echoed back to me, amplified, made strange. The glass windows fogged slightly with each exhalation, then cleared again, giving everything beyond a quality of impermanence, as if the world itself might vanish between one breath and the next. The weight of the beak pulled my head forward, made me conscious of my neck, my spine, the strange new centre of gravity I must learn to balance. And the smell. God in heaven, the smell. Inside the beak, the world smelled of rosemary and vinegar. Each breath came slow, measured like prayer. They said it would keep away the foul air, the miasma that carried the great sickness. But I think it only kept away the sound of my own heart, beating against the leather. I turned my head, and the beak followed a moment later, sweeping through the air like something with its own slow will. I could see Vincenzo watching me, his face grave and distant through the glass. I tried to speak, but my voice came out hollow, transformed, no longer entirely my own. "How does it feel?" he asked. I lifted one gloved hand, flexing the fingers, feeling the stiffness of the leather. "Like I have been buried," I said, "and yet still walk." He nodded slowly. "You will grow accustomed to it. In time, you will forget you wear it at all. And that is when you must be most careful, for the mask is not you and you are not the mask, and when the distinction blurs, you may find yourself lost somewhere between." I did not understand him then. I would understand later, in the weeks and months that followed, when I came to know the interior of that leather prison better than I knew my own thoughts. When the smell of herbs became inseparable from the smell of the afflicted, when the weight of the beak felt lighter than the weight of memory. But that first day I simply stood in his studio, learning to breathe, learning to move, learning to become the thing that would walk through Venice when Venice herself had turned away. Vincenzo helped me into the long coat, fastening it closed with leather straps. He adjusted the broad-brimmed hat that sat atop the mask, shading the glass eyes from the sun. He handed me the staff, a long rod of dark wood, polished smooth, with which I could lift sheets, point to symptoms, maintain the distance that might mean the difference between life and the silence that follows. "You will record everything," he said. "Names, locations, symptoms, the hour when their time ceased. The council requires exact accounts. We must understand what we are facing, even if understanding comes too late to save those we count." I nodded, and the beak nodded with me. "You will see things that will remain with you long after this has passed. You will hear sounds that will wake you decades hence. You will smell. Well, the beak will help with that, but it cannot protect you from memory itself." "I know," I said, though I did not know. "How could I?" "And you will be alone," he continued, his voice dropping. "The mask marks you as one apart. Children will fear you. Adults will cross themselves when you pass. Even the dogs will fall silent at your approach. You carry the authority of the council and the shadow of the grave itself. People will both need you and despise you, often in the same breath." "Why do you not wear it yourself?" I asked him. He smiled, though there was no joy in it. "I am too old for such pageantry. My lungs can no longer manage the weight of all that scent, all that filtered air. And I think—" He paused, looking away toward the window where morning light struggled through the shutters. "I think that one must be young enough to still believe that such things matter." that a mask and some herbs can hold back what has held back empires and kingdoms since time began. But you taught me that they work. I taught you that they might work, that there is reason to believe the miasma theory holds truth, that bad air, corrupted air, carries the unseen presence into the lungs, and that anything which purifies what we breathe must offer some protection. He turned back to me. But I have lived long enough to see many theories prove themselves mere hope dressed in Latin terms. And I have learned that sometimes it is the hope itself that matters, not whether it saves us, but whether it allows us to stand upright while the darkness passes. I thought about this for a long time, standing there in my strange new skin, breathing my filtered breaths, watching him through glass that made everything seem slightly unreal. "When do I begin?" I asked finally. "The bells have not yet rung," he said, "but they will. They always do." We did not wait long. Before the church clocks had struck the hour, I heard them, 3 bells in succession from San Marco, their bronze voices rolling across the city like thunder that would not cease. The signal that somewhere in Venice, in one of the narrow streets or cramped apartments or wealthy palazzos, someone had been found bearing the marks. The dark trace time could not cleanse, the swellings in the neck or groin that announced what no one wished to speak aloud. Vincenzo handed me the leather satchel containing my instruments, the lancet for examination, the small bottles of tincture, the wax tablets for recording, the official seal of the plague doctor that would grant me passage through any door, any barrier, any protest of quarantine. "Go carefully," he said. "Remember to breathe slowly. Do not touch your face. Do not remove the mask until you have returned here, and I have helped you clean it properly. And when you walk through those streets, remember, you are not merely a physician now. You are a symbol. You are the proof that someone still stands between the living and the shadow. Walk as though you believe it, even if you do not." I nodded once more, lifted the staff, and stepped out into the altered world. The street outside Vincenzo's studio had changed since I'd entered an hour before. Or perhaps I had changed, and the street merely reflected this transformation. The few people abroad gave me a wide space, pressing themselves against the walls as I passed, their eyes following the beak as it swung with each step. A woman made the sign against evil. A man removed his cap, though whether in respect or superstition I could not tell. The stones beneath my sealed boots felt different, more distant. The staff clicked against them with each step, marking my progress like some slow, relentless drum. The morning fog had not yet burned away, and it clung to the canals, rose from the water in pale curtains that made the city seem half dissolved, caught between the solid world and some other realm where borders meant nothing. I walked toward the Castello district, where the bells had sounded, following the map I had memorized and the instructions the council messenger had delivered the night before. The address was burned into my mind. A tenement near the Arsenale. 3 floors, 4th door from the corner. A family of shipwrights, 7 souls within, 4 now showing symptoms. The walk took longer than I expected, partly because I was still learning to move in the costume, learning to judge distance through glass, learning to compensate for the weight and bulk that made me wider, slower, more careful, but partly because the streets themselves seemed to resist me, to grow longer and more convoluted the deeper I went into the afflicted district. Here the silence was more complete. Doors stood marked with red crosses, the paint still wet in some cases, announcing to all that the unseen presence had found entry and must be allowed to run its course. Windows were shuttered, nailed closed from within. The straw that had been laid down to muffle sounds and absorb corrupted air lay sodden and grey, mixed with other things I did not examine closely. I passed a cart, abandoned midway through its journey. Whatever it had carried, now gone or fallen or taken by those desperate enough to risk contamination for the chance of sustenance. I passed a cat, sitting in a doorway, watching me with yellow eyes that seemed to hold no fear, only a kind of ancient patience. I passed a child's doll, lying face down in the street, and felt something catch in my throat that the herbs could not explain away. The tenement, when I found it, looked like all the others, narrow, tall, pressed between its neighbours like books on an overfilled shelf. The door stood ajar, not thrown open in panic, not barred against entry, but simply open, as though whoever had last touched it had forgotten its purpose, forgotten that doors were meant to separate inside from outside, safety from danger, the living from the still forms beneath their sheets. I stood before it for a moment, staff in hand, the fog curling around my boots. Inside the mask, my breath came louder, faster than I wished. I could smell the myrrh most strongly now, bitter and sharp, cutting through the rosemary and mint. It steadied me somehow, reminded me that I wore protection, that I carried the accumulated wisdom of centuries, that I was not walking into that darkened doorway as merely flesh and hope. I lifted the staff and pushed the door wider. The smell hit me even through the herbs, the miasma, thick and heavy, the corruption of air that had been breathed and rebreathed in a closed space where the unseen presence had made its home. The beak filtered it, transformed it, made it bearable, but it could not hide it entirely. Beneath the vinegar and camphor, I could detect the sweetness of fever sweat, the sourness of waste, the thick heaviness of too many people in too small a space for too long a time. The entry hall was dark. What light entered came from cracks in the shutters above, falling in thin bars across the floor. I could see the stairs leading upward, narrow and steep. On the wall, someone had hung a crucifix. On the floor lay a bowl, cracked, its contents long since dried. "Plague Doctor," I called out, and my voice echoed strangely, amplified and hollowed by the mask. "I am sent by the Council of Health. I have come to examine and assist." No response, only silence, and beneath it, a sound that might have been breathing, or might have been the building itself settling into its own slow collapse. I began to climb. The stairs creaked beneath my weight. The staff helped me balance, kept me steady as I ascended into the darkened heights. On the second floor, I passed a door that stood open. Inside, I glimpsed a room empty of life, the furniture overturned, a pot still sitting on a cold hearth. The occupants had fled or been taken or remained elsewhere. I did not enter to investigate. The third floor held the family I sought. The door bore no mark, no cross, no seal. This was my task: to examine, to confirm, to make official what was already known but must be witnessed and recorded for the Council's great accounting. I knocked once with the staff, waited, then pushed the door inward. 4 windows, all shuttered. A single oil lamp burning low on a table, its flame barely alive, and in the dim amber light it cast, I saw them. The father sat in a chair near the table, his head back, his mouth open, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, but his chest still rose and fell, slow and laboured. Beside him, on a pallet of straw and blankets, lay the mother and 3 children pressed close together, as though even now they sought to share warmth against a cold that had nothing to do with winter. The mother's eyes were open, watching me, but she did not speak. Could not speak, perhaps. Her throat bore the telltale swellings dark beneath the skin, the body's futile attempt to trap what had already spread beyond trapping. 2 other children stood in the corner, unafflicted as yet, their eyes enormous in the lamplight. A boy of perhaps 10 years, a girl younger. They watched me with that particular stillness that children adopt when the world has become incomprehensible, and the only safety lies in not moving, not speaking, not drawing the attention of forces beyond understanding. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the beak pointing toward them like some strange compass. Tell me, how much fear can a man hide behind leather? In that moment, I was grateful for the mask, grateful that they could not see my face, could not read in my expression what I felt upon seeing them arranged thus, the living and the nearly departed, pressed into a single small space where the air itself had turned against them. I entered slowly, staff first, taking care not to touch anything unless necessary. The floorboards were sticky beneath my boots, with what I did not wish to know. I approached the father first, maintaining the proper distance, using the staff to gently tilt his head so I might see his neck more clearly. There, the swellings, hard beneath the skin, the size of walnuts, dark marks spreading from them like ink in water. His pulse, when I reached out with my gloved hand to find it at his wrist, was racing and thin, a bird's heart trying to outfly what pursued it. His forehead burned with fever, hot enough that I could feel it through the leather. His breath, when it came, rattled in his chest like stones in a wooden box. I moved to the mother and children on the pallet. The same signs, the same dark marks. The mother's eyes followed me but held no plea, no hope, no fear. Only a kind of exhausted recognition, as though she had already passed beyond the country where such emotions dwelled and now merely waited for the rest of her body to follow. The eldest boy on the pallet, perhaps 8 years old, still had colour in his cheeks. His fever was newer, his swelling smaller. There might be time, I thought. There is often time at the beginning, that narrow window when the body still believes it might win, when bleeding and cooling and prayer might tip the balance. But I knew, even as I thought it, that such windows closed with terrible speed, and that by the time I could return with my preparations, it would likely have shut. I straightened, turned to face the 2 children in the corner. "Your names," I said, softening my voice as much as the mask allowed. The boy swallowed. "Marco," he whispered. "My sister is Lucia." "How long have they been thus?" "Mother took ill 3 days past. Father yesterday. The others," he glanced at the pallet, "this morning." 3 days. The progression was swift then. Swifter than some outbreaks, slower than others. No pattern, no mercy, no logic save the terrible arithmetic of contagion. "Have you shown any symptoms?" I asked. "Fever? Aches? Swellings?" Both children shook their heads. "We feel well," Marco said, though his voice betrayed him. I nodded, the beak dipping. "You are to remain here," I told them. "The door will be marked. Food will be left outside twice daily. You must not leave this room, must not open the windows, must not have contact with anyone beyond this door for 20 days. 20 days? The boy's voice cracked. "It is the law. It is also your best chance." I lifted the staff, pointing to the shuttered windows. "The air outside is corrupted. The air inside has been corrupted. You must burn what incense you have, keep the lamp lit always, breathe through cloth if you must move near the afflicted. Wash your hands in vinegar if you touch them. Do not share their cups or bowls." "Will they?" Lucia's voice was so small I barely heard it through the mask. I turned to look at the pallet again, at the mother's half-open eyes, the father's laboured breathing. "I will do what may be done," I said, "but you must prepare yourselves. The shadow has entered this house, and it does not often leave without payment. Harsh words, perhaps, but kindness in such moments can be crueler than truth." I'd learned this from Vincenzo, who had learned it from his own master, who had learned it from the long centuries of physicians standing before the afflicted and measuring the weight of hope against the weight of what they knew. I moved through the room then, performing the examinations that the council required, recording symptoms with a piece of charcoal on my wax tablet. The father, high fever, buboes in neck and groin, discoloration of extremities, rapid pulse, laboured breathing. The mother, same symptoms, more advanced, possible bleeding beneath the skin. The children on the pallet, early stages, fevers mounting, buboes beginning to form. I opened my satchel and removed what I carried. Small bottles of tincture, willow bark for fever, a lancet for bleeding if the body's humours needed balancing, cloths soaked in vinegar. I left these on the table, knowing they would do little but believing that to offer nothing was to abandon these people entirely to the darkness. "Apply the vinegar cloths to the swellings," I told Marco. "Change them each hour. Try to make them drink water, even if they refuse. Keep the lamp burning. If..." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "If any of them grow still, cover them with the sheet and do not touch them again. Place a candle at their feet and wait for the collectors." The boy nodded, his face pale but steady. Children, I had already learned, could be stronger than adults when the world collapsed. They had not yet learned to believe in their own permanence, and so its loss shocked them less. I turned to leave, then stopped. From my satchel I removed 2 small pouches of herbs, lavender and mint mixed with camphor, and held them out. "Keep these in your pockets," I said. "Breathe through them when the air grows too heavy. It may help." Marco took them with both hands, as though I had offered treasures beyond price. Perhaps I had. In a city where the air itself had become enemy, what was more valuable than the promise of clean breath? I left them there, in that dim room with its dying lamp and its dying occupants, and descended once more into the street. Outside, I used my staff to mark the door with chalk, the symbol that indicated plague within, examination complete, quarantine in effect. The rain would wash it away eventually, but it would serve until the official painters arrived with their red crosses and their terrible finality. The fog had thickened while I was inside. The street had disappeared into greyness, and I walked through it as though walking through the space between worlds, neither fully in Venice nor fully elsewhere. The Beak cut through the mist, and I followed it, letting it guide me back toward the council offices where I would file my report. Behind me I heard no sound from the tenement, no cries, no prayers, no weeping, only silence, settling like snow over that small space where 4 people waited for their time to cease, and 2 children tried to understand how the world had become a place where mothers could not rise, and fathers could not speak, and all the warmth had drained away into the corrupted air. This was my first house, my first family, my first step into the territory I would come to know as intimately as my own skin, the landscape of the Great Sickness, where geography was measured not in streets and canals, but in symptoms and stages, in the hours between fever's first touch and the silence that followed. I would visit 43 more houses before that first day ended. I would examine 117 people. I would record 62 names in my ledger of those whose time had ceased. And with each house, each examination, each notation in the wax, I felt something within me shift and settle, hardening like wax itself when the heat leaves it. I was becoming what I wore. The mask was no longer merely leather and glass and herbs, but a shell I inhabited, a carapace that allowed me to walk through horrors that would have broken the man I'd been that morning. By the time I returned to Vincenzo's studio, the sun was setting, its light filtered through smoke and fog into something neither day nor night, but a grey suspension between states. My master was waiting, and he helped me remove the costume piece by piece, checking each component for signs of contamination, cleaning them with alcohol and vinegar, hanging them to air in the room he had designated for this purpose. When the mask finally came off, my face felt strange, naked, too small for the skin it wore. The air smelled unbearably sweet and empty without the herbs. My breathing, no longer amplified and echoed, seemed too quiet, too insignificant. "Drink," Vincenzo said, handing me wine mixed with wormwood. "It will help clear your lungs of any miasma that penetrated the mask." I drank. It tasted bitter and clean. "How many?" he asked. 62, I said. "Today?" He nodded slowly as though I had confirmed something he already knew. "It is beginning then. The true progression. Yesterday there were 40. Tomorrow there will be more." "The numbers mean nothing," I said, surprising myself with the flatness in my voice. "Each one is a person, a name, a life that ceased." "The numbers mean everything," he corrected gently. "They tell us the speed of spread, the pattern of infection, the places we must focus our resources. If we do not count, we cannot act. If we cannot act, we can only wait for the shadow to pass over us all." "And the mask?" I asked. "Did it protect me?" He looked at me for a long moment. "You are here, speaking with me, breathing unencumbered air. So either it protected you, or you were not meant to fall today. Sometimes these amount to the same thing." I wanted to ask him which he believed, but I was too tired, and the day had taught me that some questions have no answers that satisfy. So I drank my wine, and I let him prepare a bed for me in his studio, and I slept the sleep of those who have walked through the valley and emerged on the other side, at least for now. In my dreams, I wore the mask still, and in my dreams, the beak grew longer with each breath, until it stretched before me like a road with no ending, a path I would walk forever, breathing herbs and vinegar, marking doors, recording names in ledgers that no one would ever read. When I woke, the bells were already ringing, 3 times in succession echoing across the city, calling me back to the work. I rose, washed my face in cold water, and stood before the costume where it hung on the wall, waiting. The mask's glass eyes caught the morning light and held it. Empty eyes. Patient eyes. Eyes that had seen what I had seen and would see it again countless times, until the shadow lifted, or I fell beneath it. I lifted it from its hook. I opened the beak and began again to fill it with our defences. Rose petals, mint myrrh, camphor, vinegar. The smell rose to meet me like an old companion, familiar now, almost comforting in its sharpness. Then I put it on, and became once more the thing that walks between, neither physician nor priest, neither living nor dead, but something the city needed me to be. Something that could look upon what others turned away from, and still continue standing. The mask had become my face, and I had become what lived behind it. This was only the second day. There would be many more to follow. The weeks that followed blurred together in ways that memory struggles to separate now, decades later. Each day began with the bells, ended with the removal of the mask, and contained between those 2 points more suffering than any ledger could properly record. I learned the geography of the great sickness not through maps but through the routes I walked, the doors I marked, the faces that watched me pass, with that mixture of dread and desperate hope that the afflicted reserve for those who might hold some answer, some relief, some miracle wrapped in leather and herbs. The city emptied in stages. First the wealthy departed, their boats laden with furniture and servants, heading for estates in the countryside, where they believed clean air and distance might spare them. Then the merchants who could afford to close their shops and wait out the shadows passing. Then the artisans whose trades could survive interruption. Those who remained were those who had no choice. The poor who owned nothing but their labour. The workers whose absence would mean starvation even if it might mean survival. And those of us who had been charged by the council to stand in the spaces the others fled. I learned to recognise the stages of affliction by sight alone. The early stage, when fever first took hold and the person moved slowly, carefully, as though their body had become unfamiliar territory. The middle stage, when the swellings appeared and the skin took on that particular greyness that speaks of blood turning against itself. The final stage, when coherence left and only the body's animal persistence remained, breathing and heartbeat continuing long after the person within had already departed, to wherever persons go when the flesh becomes merely vessel. I learned to tell from a doorway whether anyone living remained within. The quality of silence differs when shared only with the departed. The air itself changes, grows heavier, settles into a stillness that breath interrupts, but death perfects. I learned which prayers the different parishes preferred, which arrangements the various neighbourhoods found proper, which protocols the council required, and which could be adjusted for mercy's sake, when mercy cost nothing, and might mean everything to those watching. But most of all, I learned the interior of the mask. Inside that leather shell, breathing filtered air, watching the world through glass that fogged and cleared with each breath, I discovered a strange country. It was separate from Venice, as separate as an island from the mainland, though I walked the same streets and entered the same houses. The mask created its own atmosphere, its own climate. Temperature meant less. Smell was transformed, made uniform. Vision became circumscribed, focused. I could see clearly what lay directly before me, but peripheral awareness faded, made the world feel narrower, more intense. And sound became peculiar. My own breathing dominated, constant as waves, providing a rhythm to which my heartbeat synchronized. Voices from outside came muffled, distant, as though I heard them through water or thick walls. My own voice, when I spoke, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, amplified by the beak's hollow structure, emerging strange and half-mechanical. In this altered country, fear became abstract. Not absent, I never lost awareness of danger, of the thousand ways corruption might breach my defences, but transformed into something intellectual rather than visceral. The racing pulse, the cold sweat, the urge to flee that the naked face feels when confronting pestilence. These were dampened, held at bay by the same layers that held the miasma at bay. Was this courage, or merely the mask's gift, allowing me to function where the naked self would falter? Vincenzo had warned me, when you forget you wear it, that is when you must be most careful. I came to understand his meaning. The mask could become transparent to itself, my awareness passing through it as though it were not there, as though the filtered air was simply air, The glass eyes, my own eyes. The beak, my own face thrust forward into the world. In these moments of forgetting, I felt powerful, untouchable. The shadow could pass within inches of me, could fill the very room where I stood, could take everyone around me while leaving me untouched. What was I then but proof that knowledge was indeed armour, that the old wisdom had substance, that humanity need not be helpless before the invisible enemy? But then I would catch my reflection in a shuttered window, in the polished brass of a wealthy household, in the still water of a canal, and I would see what others saw. The figure in the dark coat, the leather face with its glass eyes, the terrible beak pointing like an accusation. I would see the thing I had become, neither human nor beast, but some third category for which Italian had no proper word, and the power would drain away, replaced by a different understanding, that the mask protected me not because it was strong, but because I was isolated, that the safety it provided came not from herbs and glass, but from the absolute separation it enforced. Inside the mask, I was alone, completely alone. Even when standing in a room full of the afflicted, even when surrounded by the collectors and the council officials and the priests performing their final offices, I was solitary in a way that has no parallel in ordinary life. The mask was both shield and prison. It kept death out. It kept life out as well. Is this why the costume disturbs you still, centuries later? Not because it is strange, but because it is honest. It shows what you prefer not to see, that safety and connection cannot always coexist, that survival sometimes requires becoming something other than what we wish to be, that the price of standing against darkness may be standing alone. Venice had always been a city of masks, of course. The Carnival masks, beautiful and elaborate, that allowed nobles to shed their identities and mingle with commoners, that permitted sins to flourish under cover of anonymity, that transformed the city each year into a place where nothing was quite what it seemed. But those masks were about joy, about release, about becoming more than oneself. My mask was different. It was about becoming less, about shedding precisely those aspects of humanity that the unseen presence exploited, the need for closeness, for breath, for touch, for the 1,000 small connections that make life bearable and also make us vulnerable. I remember a house in the Dorsoduro, a sculptor's workshop and home. 3 floors, beautiful stonework, windows that would have caught the morning light had they not been sealed against the corrupted air. The sculptor himself had been taken early, but his wife and 2 adult children remained, all 3 showing the signs. The daughter, I never learned her name, she could not speak, and her family could not or would not tell me, lay on a bed near the window, her body twisted with fever, her neck swollen with buboes the size of eggs. But her eyes were clear, conscious, aware. She watched me move through the room with an expression I have never forgotten, not fear, not hope, but a profound sadness mixed with something that might have been gratitude. I examined her as I had examined hundreds of others. Pulse, fever, swelling, discoloration. I recorded the symptoms, prepared what simple relief I could offer. But when I turned to leave, she reached out, not to touch me, for even in her extremity she understood the necessity of distance, but simply to extend her hand in the space between us. A gesture. Nothing more. A reaching across the gap that the mask enforced. I stood there, staff in hand, looking at that outstretched palm, the beak pointed toward her, steady and impassive. Inside the mask I felt something break, not dramatically, not with sound or pain, but simply break. A small thing, a necessary thing perhaps, that had kept me upright and functional through the previous weeks. I could not take her hand. The protocols were absolute. Touch meant contamination. Contamination meant death. Death meant failure of every principle I served. But I could not simply turn away either, could not let that gesture fall into emptiness and mean nothing. So I did what the mask allowed. I lowered the staff gently until its polished wood rested against her palm. Separated by leather glove and wooden length, we were nevertheless connected. For perhaps 3 heartbeats, I held the staff there, and she curled her fingers around it, and in that moment we achieved what communication we could across the distance the shadow imposed. Then I withdrew, and she let her hand fall back to the sheet, and I left that room knowing she would not survive to see another sunset. The council records confirmed it 2 days later. The sculptor's daughter, name unlisted, age approximately 20 years. Time ceased on the evening of June 4th, 1656, but I remember her hand, reaching. I remember that she tried, even then, to bridge the gap. And I remember that the mask, for all its protection, could not protect me from the weight of being the last human presence some people would know, and being that presence only at a distance, only through glass and leather and herbs, only as this strange amalgam of physician and phantom. The summer deepened, and the shadow deepened with it. The heat made everything worse. Bodies could not be left waiting as long. The miasma thickened in the narrow streets where sunlight never reached. The canals grew sluggish, their water heavy with corruption. Even inside the mask, even through the fortress of scent I breathed, I could detect the change, a sweetness that should not exist, a heaviness that pressed against the leather and sought entry through every seam. The council increased my territory. 2 other plague doctors had themselves been taken by what they fought. A third had fled the city, breaking his contract, choosing the dishonour of cowardice over the honour of service. Perhaps he was the wisest of us all. I do not know. I only know that his territory became mine, and my days stretched longer, my routes more circuitous, my ledger heavier with names that meant nothing to anyone except those who had loved them. I developed routines, as all who face horror must. The mind requires patterns, requires something familiar to grasp when everything else has become strange. I would wake before dawn, wash thoroughly, dress in my ordinary clothes and eat whatever Vincenzo had prepared. Simple food, bread and cheese mostly. Sometimes fish if the market still had any. Then the bells would begin, and I would begin the transformation. First the boots, sealed carefully. Checked for any crack or weakness where corruption might creep in. Then the long coat, fastened at every closure, waxed surface catching the light. Then the gloves, extending past the elbows, overlapping the coat's sleeves. Then the hat, broad-brimmed, practical. And finally the mask itself, the beak freshly packed each morning with our defences, the leather straps adjusted until it sat firmly against my face, until my breath came only through the herbs and my vision narrowed to what the glass eyes permitted, the staff last. Always the staff last, lifted from its corner, balanced in my gloved hand, its weight a kind of anchor that connected the person I had been before transformation to the thing I had become after. Then out into the city, into the grey morning that seemed endless, into the streets that had been emptied of all but necessity and sorrow. I learned which houses to visit in which order, the ones where hope still lived, where early intervention might mean survival. These first, while my energy was high and my attention sharp. The ones where only final offices remained, these in the middle hours, when the sun had burned away the fog, and the city seemed almost normal if you did not look too closely. And the ones where only counting remained, where I came merely to record and certify and ensure the council's ledgers matched reality. These last, in the declining light, when exhaustion made the work mechanical and mercy lay in not thinking too deeply about what the numbers represented. I learned to read a street before entering it. The presence of birds meant life, or at least the absence of overwhelming corruption. The presence of rats meant the same. They fled what killed indiscriminately, gathered where selective death left scraps. The absence of both meant something had emptied that space so thoroughly that even scavengers would not risk it. I learned which parishes buried their departed most promptly, which ones let them accumulate until the collectors could make efficient rounds. I learned which priests would enter a plague house to perform the final rites, and which would stand in the doorway, sprinkling holy water from a distance and muttering prayers too quickly to be understood. I learned which neighbourhoods still had someone who would volunteer to sit with the dying, holding vigil even at risk of their own life, and which ones had been so scoured by fear that the afflicted died alone, unwatched, uncomforted. And I learned the limits of what the mask could do. There was a morning in late July when I entered a house near the Rialto, a merchant's house, once prosperous, now silent. The door had been left open, not broken, simply open, as though someone had walked out meaning to return, and never did. Inside, the usual signs: the smell of corruption beneath the herbs, the dim light through shuttered windows, the heaviness of air that had been trapped too long. I found the merchant on the second floor, in what had been his counting room. He sat at his desk, his ledgers open before him, his pen still in his hand. But his time had ceased, likely days before. The room was very warm, and his body had begun the transformations that warm rooms and death together produce. I stood in the doorway, staff extended, examining the scene. According to protocol, I should note his position, his apparent symptoms, the approximate time of his passing. I should mark the door, file the report, alert the collectors. Simple procedures, done hundreds of times. But as I stood there, breathing my filtered air, I noticed something that made me pause. On the desk beside his ledgers lay a letter, unsealed, unfinished. The ink had dried long ago, leaving the final sentence incomplete. I could read it from where I stood, my vision narrowed but still functional. To my daughter Elisabetta in Padua, I write to tell you that your mother's time ceased 3 days past, and I fear that I too am... That was all. The sentence ended there, the word unfinished, the thought abandoned when he no longer had strength to hold the pen. The mask prevented me from reading any further without entering the room, and entering the room would mean greater risk of contamination. But I stood there longer than protocol required, looking at that unfinished letter, that attempt to reach across distance and time to tell a daughter something she needed to know. Eventually I withdrew, marked the door, filed the report. The collectors came, the body was removed, the house sealed. Standard procedures efficiently executed. But that letter remained in my thoughts. Still remains, these many years later. A message cast into the void, hoping to arrive somewhere safe, but stopped halfway between the living and the departed. We were all writing unfinished letters, I think, all of us who remained in Venice that summer. Letters to futures we hoped to see, to versions of ourselves we hoped to become again when the shadow lifted, to lives we had left in suspension and prayed would still be waiting when we returned. The mask was my letter, in a way, a message written in leather and glass that said, I am still here, still standing, still fighting, whether anyone read that message or not. By August, the heat had become impossible to separate from the pestilence. They seemed the same thing, both invisible, both overwhelming, both inescapable. Inside the mask, the temperature climbed until I felt I breathed not air but liquid warmth, thick and heavy. The herbs grew damp with sweat and condensation. The glass, fogged more frequently, required constant adjustment of breathing to maintain visibility. Vincenzo worried about me. I could see it in his face each evening when I returned, in the way he examined me, not just for symptoms, but for some other kind of damage, some wearing away that had nothing to do with the body's functions. He tried to convince me to take days of rest, to let others share the burden, but there were no others. The few remaining plague doctors were as overburdened as I, and to rest would mean houses unvisited, families uncounted, the shadow spreading further while we caught our breath. So I continued, and the mask continued, and Venice continued to empty itself of sound and motion, until some days it seemed I walked through a city of stone and water only. All the life drained away, leaving just architecture and absence. But there were still moments that pierced through the exhaustion, that made it through the mask's defences and lodged in memory with a clarity that decades have not dimmed. A child in Santa Croce, no more than 5 years old, who showed no symptoms yet but sat beside his mother's still form, holding her hand, singing to her in a voice so pure and clear that I heard it even through the leather. He did not look at me when I entered, did not acknowledge the beak-faced creature that had come to take his mother away into the council's count. He simply sang. Lullabies, I think, though I did not know the words. Songs his mother had sung to him, perhaps, now returned to her as she lay beyond the country where songs could reach. I examined her, confirmed what was already evident, recorded the details in my ledger. But I did not interrupt his singing. I stood there, staff in hand, and let him finish the song before I spoke to tell him that men would come, that he must go with them to the quarantine house, that his mother would be tended to according to proper rites. He nodded when I finished, but did not stop holding her hand. And when the collectors came later that day, I made sure they understood. The boy was to be treated gently, was to be allowed to keep whatever small possessions he carried, was not to be told that his singing had been futile or foolish, or anything other than the most natural response to loss that exists. Whether they honoured that request, I do not know. The machinery of plague management was vast and impersonal, and I was only one small cog within it, rotating through my prescribed motions, recording my prescribed observations. But I hoped. Inside the mask, where hope and despair existed at the same remove, where everything was filtered through the same dulling layers, I nevertheless hoped. An old woman in Cannaregio who had outlived 3 husbands and 7 children, who showed no symptoms despite having nursed her entire neighbourhood through the worst of it. She laughed when I examined her, actually laughed, a sound so unexpected that I stepped back instinctively, staff raised as though humour itself might be contagious. "You think I am immortal, Doctor," she said, her voice rough but amused. "You think the shadow fears these old bones?" "I think you have been extraordinarily fortunate," I said carefully. "Fortunate," she laughed again. "No, boy, not fortunate, just stubborn. The shadow comes for everyone in time, but it takes the weak first, the fearful. I am neither weak nor fearful, so it passes me by, saves me for later when it has nothing better to do than collect old women who have lived too long anyway." "You should not speak of yourself thus," I said, though I did not know why I felt compelled to offer this comfort. "And you should not walk the streets dressed as a bird of ill omen," she replied. "But here we both are doing what we must. Tell me, Doctor, does the mask work? Do your herbs and your glass truly keep the shadow at bay?" I hesitated. Inside the mask, my breath came faster, louder. Through the glass, I looked at this old woman who had survived what had taken the young and the healthy, who sat in her small room surrounded by evidence of her many losses, and yet still lived, still spoke, still found cause for laughter. "I do not know," I said finally, and it was the first time I had spoken that truth aloud to anyone but myself. "I believe it does. The theory is sound, the protection seems effective, but belief and seeming are not the same as knowing, and I will not truly know until this is over, and I can look back and see whether I stood behind it, or whether it stood behind me." She nodded slowly. "An honest answer, better than false certainty. The shadow respects honesty, I think. Or, at least it does not punish it more than it punishes lies." She reached into a pocket and produced a small, carved figure. A bird, ironically, though a normal bird, not the long-beaked creature I resembled. "Take this," she said. "My second husband made it. He was a woodcarver, good with his hands. It is meant to bring luck, though it did not bring him luck enough to save him. Perhaps it will do better for you." I should have refused. Protocol discouraged accepting anything from plague houses, anything that might carry contamination. But I found myself reaching out, my gloved hand closing around the small carving, feeling its weight through the leather. "Thank you," I said. "Do not thank me yet," she replied. "Thank me if you survive to remember this conversation. Otherwise, my gift will go into the ground with you, and neither of us will have gained anything from this meeting." 3 weeks later, I returned to check on her. The door stood open. The room was empty. The collector's ledger recorded that she had been taken to the pest house, had lasted 2 days there before her time ceased. The shadow had collected its debt after all. But the carved bird remained in my pocket through all the months that followed. I kept it there, carried it through every house, every examination, every marking of doors. A talisman, perhaps, or simply a reminder that even in the depths of the shadow's reign, people remained themselves, stubborn, humorous, kind in unexpected moments, capable of gift-giving even when they had nothing left to give. The mask could not protect against such memories, could not filter them out or transform them into something manageable. They accumulated inside me behind the leather and glass, building up like sediment until I felt heavy with them, weighed down by the sheer quantity of witnessed suffering that the mask had allowed me to approach but not to heal. September brought cooler air, and with it a gradual slowing of the shadow's advance. The number of new cases declined, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, like a tide that has reached its highest mark and begun, almost imperceptibly, to withdraw. The bells rang less frequently. The streets, though still largely empty, no longer felt quite so much like passages through a dead city. Birds returned. Rats grew bolder. Life in its scavenging forms began to reclaim the spaces death had dominated, but the work continued. The Shadow's retreat was not the same as its departure. Houses still needed visiting. The afflicted still required examination. The count still had to be maintained. And now, a new task emerged: the inspection of quarantined households, determining who could be released, who must remain, who had survived, and who had not. I found that this work, in some ways, was harder than the work of the peak weeks. During the worst of it, there had been a kind of terrible simplicity. Everything was urgent, everything mattered, every moment held the weight of life and death balanced on the edge of a staff's reach. But now, in the slow unwinding, in the gradual return to something approaching normality, the losses became more distinct, more personal somehow. The numbers had faces again. The names had histories. I walked through houses where entire families had been erased, not fled, not scattered, but simply ended. Houses where children's toys lay gathering dust, where meals sat abandoned on tables, where mirrors reflected only my masked face because no other faces remained to reflect. Houses that would stand empty for years, perhaps, avoided by the superstitious, eventually claimed by the city or the church or distant relatives who had not loved the occupants enough to stay but loved their property enough to return. What do you do with a city of absences? How do you rebuild when the empty spaces outnumber the full ones? These were not questions for a plague doctor to answer. My task was simpler: examine, record, certify, move on. Let others worry about reconstruction. Let others decide how to fill the gaps the Shadow had carved into Venice's fabric. My responsibility ended at the documentation, at the careful notation in ledgers that would be filed and forgotten once the immediate crisis passed. But inside the mask, in the privacy of my filtered breath and circumscribed vision, I found myself asking anyway. Found myself wondering what would become of all this carefully recorded information, all these names and dates and symptoms so meticulously documented. Would anyone ever read them? Would they inform some future understanding, help some future physician face some future shadow with better weapons than herbs and glass? Or would they simply moulder in the council archives, gradually becoming illegible, eventually discarded to make room for the records of new crises, new emergencies, new catastrophes that would demand their own accounting? I did not know, could not know. And in the end, perhaps it did not matter. The record existed because the record was what we had, what we could offer against the void. Proof that we had witnessed, that we had counted, that we had not let the Shadow take everything without at least inscribing the losses into history. October arrived, and with it the official declaration: the great sickness had passed its peak, was in retreat, would likely be ended by winter's cold. Quarantines could be lifted selectively. Markets could reopen under supervision. The wealthy could return from their country estates to find their palazzos either intact or emptied by looters who had cared more for objects than for avoiding contamination. The council informed me that my contract would conclude at month's end. A generous payment was arranged, generous because so many of us had not survived to collect it, because guilt demanded that those who remained be well compensated, because money was easier than gratitude or acknowledgement of what we had witnessed and what it had cost us. I accepted the payment without comment, without celebration. What would I celebrate? My survival? The Shadow's retreat? The fact that I had walked through 100 houses of death and emerged with my body intact, even if something less tangible had been worn away by the passage? Vincenzo threw no feast, offered no congratulations. He simply helped me remove the costume for the final time, cleaned it thoroughly, and hung it in the back room where it would wait for the next crisis, the next outbreak, the next person desperate or foolish enough to believe that leather and herbs could stand between humanity and its oldest enemy. "You did well," he said quietly as we stored the last pieces. "You fulfilled your contract. You maintained the protocols. You survived." "Did I?" I asked, surprising myself with a question. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw in his eyes that he understood what I meant. The mask protected your body, he said. What it did to the rest, that is something each man must reckon with in his own way, in his own time. I left his studio that evening and walked through Venice as myself. No mask, no beak, no glass eyes between me and the world. The air smelled strange, too rich, too full of scents that the herbs had kept at bay. The world seemed too wide, my peripheral vision too broad, my face too exposed. People did not avoid me. Children did not fall silent at my approach. I was simply another man walking through the dimming light, unremarkable, anonymous, normal. I hated it. Not immediately, not consciously. But somewhere in the weeks that followed, as I attempted to return to ordinary life, to ordinary practice, to the treatment of ordinary ailments that did not end in silence and shadow, I found myself missing the mask's protection, missing the distance it enforced, the solitude it guaranteed, the clarity of purpose it provided. Behind the mask, I had known exactly what I was meant to do. Examine, record, move on. Simple. Terrible, but simple. Outside the mask, in the world of ordinary medicine where patients recovered and complained and required ongoing care and attention, where relationships developed and expectations accumulated and nothing was ever quite finished, I felt lost, unmoored, as though I had learned to live underwater and now found the surface world too bright, too loud, too demanding of engagement I no longer knew how to offer. I dreamed of the mask often, dreamed I was wearing it, walking through empty streets, breathing herbs and silence. Sometimes these were nightmares. Sometimes they were not. Sometimes I woke missing the weight of the beak, the narrowed vision, the filtered air. Sometimes I woke grateful it was gone. I could not always tell which response was healthier, which one spoke of healing, and which spoke of damage that would not heal. Months passed. The city refilled itself with people and commerce and noise. The empty houses were gradually claimed or demolished. The marks on doors were scrubbed away or painted over. The red crosses that had announced the shadow's presence faded into memory, then into forgetting. Venice was very good at forgetting, I discovered. Very practiced at moving forward, at covering over the recent past with new presents, at transforming trauma into history, into legend, into nothing at all. But some of us could not forget. Some of us carried the weight of what we had witnessed, what we had counted, what we had walked among. And some of us, I will speak only for myself, carried the mask even after we had removed it, felt its weight on our faces even decades later, smelled the herbs and vinegar in moments of stress or sorrow, heard our breathing echo back at us when we lay awake in darkness. The mask had protected me, but protection has its price, and I am not certain even now whether the balance came out in my favour. I left Venice in the spring of 1658, 2 years after I first put on the mask. Not fleeing, not driven out, but simply leaving. The city no longer felt like home, if it ever truly had. Too many absences, too many empty spaces where people had been, too many streets I could not walk, without remembering who I had found there, how they had looked at me, what I had recorded in my ledger before moving on. I travelled north into the Alps, finding work in small villages where plague was a distant fear rather than a recent memory. I practiced ordinary medicine, treated ordinary ailments, lived an ordinary life. I did not speak of Venice, did not mention the mask, did not reveal that I had been one of those strange beaked figures that haunted the imagination of those who heard tales of the plague cities. But I kept the carved bird the old woman had given me, kept it in my pocket, turned it over in my fingers during difficult cases, reminded myself that even in the depths of shadow, kindness persisted, humour survived, people remained more than their suffering, and I wrote. Not immediately, but gradually, over years and decades, I recorded what I remembered. Not for publication, who would wish to read such things, but for the simple need to place it outside myself, to give it form in words so that it might weigh less heavily in memory. This account is the fruit of that long effort. These words are my attempt to explain what cannot be fully explained, what it meant to walk through that time, to wear that costume, to become that thing between physician and phantom that the plague doctor had to be. I want you to understand something. The mask was not theatre. It was not costume drama or morbid fancy or medieval superstition. It was the best protection we knew how to construct, based on the best theories we had access to, worn by people who had to believe, that knowledge could be armor, that understanding could be defense, that humanity need not be entirely helpless before the invisible. Was it perfect? No. Many of us died wearing it, our filtered breath ultimately no match for what we fought. Was it useless? No. Some of us survived, and whether that was the mask's doing or mere chance, I cannot say with certainty. But it was the attempt that mattered. The effort to stand upright in the face of overwhelming darkness, to maintain protocol and procedure, and careful observation even when the world collapsed around us. The long leather coat, the gloves, the boots sealed with tallow, the staff for distance, the beak filled with herbs. These were not symbols of death, but symbols of refusal. Refusal to accept that death must proceed unopposed. Refusal to abandon the sick to die alone. Refusal to let fear become the only response to terror. Tell me, would you have worn it? Would you have believed that vinegar and rosemary and myrrh could keep corruption at bay? Would you have walked into houses where the shadow waited, armed with nothing but a staff and a leather shell, and the conviction that witness itself has value, that counting matters, that standing in the darkness serves some purpose, even if only to prove that someone stood? I do not know what courage is truly, but I know that every morning I put on that mask I was terrified. And every evening I removed it, I was grateful, not merely to have survived, but to have served some purpose beyond my own preservation. To have been present for those who had no one else, to have recorded their passage so that they did not simply vanish into the void uncounted and unmarked. The mask was heavy, the work was terrible, the losses were beyond numbering, though I numbered them anyway because that was my task. But I did it. We did it. Those of us who wore the beak and walked through Venice when Venice had been abandoned by almost everyone with the means to leave. We did it because someone had to, because the sick deserved care even if care could not save them, because the departed deserved counting even if counting could not retrieve them, because witness has value, observation has meaning. Presence itself is a kind of ministry when everything else has failed. This is what I wish you to understand. You, who look back across the centuries and see only the strange costume, the bizarre beak, the grotesque mask. You see a horror. I wore a hope. You see nightmare fuel for your entertainments. I experienced the thin edge where science meets faith, where knowledge confronts its limits, where humanity tries, desperately, imperfectly, but tries nonetheless, to be more than meat waiting for the shadow to take it. The plague doctor's costume was not about fashion. It was about courage disguised as procedure, desperation clothed in leather, the refusal to yield made manifest in glass and herbs and waxed cloth. And yes, it was also about loneliness, about the profound isolation of being the one who stays when everyone else leaves, about the cost of being present for death without being able to prevent it, about breathing filtered air while all around you, the unfiltered air carries corruption and despair. But isolation, I learned, is not the same as abandonment. Standing alone is not the same as standing for nothing. And the mask, for all that it separated me from the world, also connected me to something larger, to the long history of physicians who have stood in hopeless places, to the tradition of healing that persists even when healing is impossible, to the human insistence on trying, on witnessing, on counting, on maintaining procedure and protocol and careful observation even when the outcome seems already determined. I am an old man now. The plague years are long behind me. Venice has survived, thrived, transformed itself once again. The shadow will come again. It always does, in one form or another. And when it comes, others will don whatever protection their era has devised, and they will walk through whatever darkness awaits them. I hope they remember us, not for fame or glory, but simply to know they are not the first, not alone, that this terrible work has been done before, and will be done again, and that those who came before understood the weight of it, honoured the cost of it, and stood in the darkness anyway, because standing was all that remained when everything else had been tried and failed. The mask hangs now in a medical college in Padua, I'm told, A historical curiosity, a teaching tool, a reminder of how far medicine has come and how much we once did not know. Students laugh at it, I imagine, mock its strangeness, wonder how anyone could have believed such a thing might work. Let them laugh. I wore it when laughter had been driven from Venice's streets. I breathed through it when clean air seemed a luxury beyond price. I looked through its glass eyes when human eyes could not bear to see what needed to be witnessed. It protected me. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to let me do the work that needed doing. Enough to let me stand in rooms where death waited. Enough to let me be present for those whose time was ceasing, so that they did not pass entirely alone, entirely unmarked, entirely forgotten. That was the purpose. That was the meaning. Not horror, but service. Not nightmare, but witness. Not death, but the insistence that death's victory need not be total, that we can stand in its presence and record its passing and remain ourselves. Damaged perhaps, changed certainly, but unbroken. The beak and the shadow, the mask and the miasma, the leather shell and the beating heart within it. This was my life for a time. This was my service. This was what I saw when I walked through Venice in the spring of 1656 and the seasons that followed, breathing herbs and vinegar, counting losses, maintaining the count, standing in the darkness not because I was unafraid, but because fear alone is not reason enough to turn away. Would you have trusted a mask to keep the darkness away? I did. And whether it was the mask that saved me or something else entirely, fortune, fate, the shadow's whim, I cannot say with certainty. But I wore it. I walked behind it. I became what it made me become, and remained myself beneath it, and emerged from those years with both more and less than I had carried into them. The mask was my face for a season, and my face has never entirely forgotten the weight of it, the smell of it, the terrible clarity of vision that came from seeing the world through glass, while breathing air that smelled of rosemary and prayer, and desperate hope that knowledge might, just might, be enough to stand against what had stood against humanity since the beginning. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what remains when memory has stripped away everything but the essential truth. I wore the mask. I walked the streets. I counted the departed. I stood in the shadow. I survived. And whether that survival was victory or merely luck or something else entirely, I leave for others to judge. The beak pointed forward. I followed it. And behind me, Venice continued to breathe, to die, to live, to forget, to remember, to endure, as it always has, as it always will. As we all must in our own seasons of shadow, wearing whatever armour our time provides, believing or not believing but standing regardless, breathing or not breathing, but present nonetheless, marked or unmarked but witnessed, counted, recorded, remembered. This is what the mask meant. This is what it means still. Not horror, but hope, dressed in leather. Not nightmare, but the dream of knowledge becoming armour. Not death, but the fierce insistence that life deserves defenders, even when defence seems futile. I wore the beak. I lived the shadow. I remember both. And in remembering, I honour not my own survival, but those who did not survive, those I counted, those I witnessed, those who looked at my masked face, and saw not a doctor but something stranger, proof perhaps that someone still cared enough to come, to see, to record, to stand in the room while the darkness gathered. This was my work. This was my season. This was the time when I lived behind glass and leather, breathing filtered air, walking through fog and memory, becoming the thing that walks between. The plague doctor, the one who wore the beak, the one who stood in the shadow and counted what the shadow took and lived to tell it.